Welcome to this RSPA education session on password management. I'm Mark Houston, Senior Leader, Channel Marketing for WorldPay. I'm joined today by Nathan Sweeney, who's Senior Security Consultant at Secure Ideas. Welcome,
Thank you.
Nathan. Before we really get going into the heart of the conversation about password management, if there's anyone else out there who's interested in becoming a security guru, I'd encourage you to consider the RSPA membership, or if you're already a member, to make sure that you're getting the most value out of that membership with a lot of the resources that are available. This educational series is intended to present important topics that are of interest to RSPA members and other industry professionals. As a benefit of membership with RSPA, you gain access to free legal advice, contracts and agreements, important information regarding EMV shift, and then there's a fantastic member business resource portal that has within it hundreds of documents and guides for managing your business, including things such as customer contracts and agreements, internal and employee documents for managing your teams and your staff, security and PCI resources, EMV content that spans a pretty broad range of everything from videos to white papers, to up-to-date news, webinars, and additional resources that may be of value, learning tracks that are key, and of course, information on security, which is the reason why we're talking to Nathan today. So,
and I'll add on to that, Mark. We're continuing to develop that, right? So the security thing is relatively new, but we're continuing to develop resources and information that we can put on there so that this value to members continues to increase as we go.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, part of what we're doing here today
Absolutely.
is adding more and more value to the resources that are available to membership. So let's start talking about password management. So when we talk about password management, what do we mean, really?
Yeah, so just to break it down, it's really simple. We all have passwords, right? We use passwords to authenticate ourselves. The password is how you know that I'm me, right? If I say, here's my username and I'm trying to log into a system, the password is one way that I'm able to authenticate and say, I'm the only one that's supposed to know this password. This is who I am. So the problem is we have tons of systems. Every user, every person, individual has potentially hundreds of passwords they have to keep track of. So the idea of password management takes into consideration not just how we manage passwords, but how we create passwords, how we store passwords, how we use passwords. All of those things are part of that and the topic that we're going to talk about today.
And then obviously, I mean, maybe it's so obvious it doesn't really warrant a whole lot of words around it, but so what? So why is it important for me to think about password management in a broader context versus kind of a one-off, okay, I've got this password for this system, this password. Why do I need to pull back and think about password management more broadly?
Yeah, so for an individual, most people do a really bad job of coming up with stuff on the fly, with coming up with a new password, right? We've all been at that point where our computer says, hey, it's time to change your password. And you think, oh, shoot, what do I do? Well, last time my password was Superman 1 exclamation. Now I change it to Superman 2 exclamation, right? Because we're trying to think on the fly and we don't do a good job. By having a plan, by thinking it through and saying, here's what we're going to do, it gives us some intentionality so that when we get to that spot, we already have a plan, we know what we're going to do. That's from the individual perspective. From the reseller perspective, you have a little bit more at stake because these passwords are how you are authenticating your people, and that authentication is then being used to access your internal systems and likely even to access your merchants through remote access tools and stuff like that. So you need to make sure that that authentication really is your technician and it's not some bad guy in Eastern Europe that just stole the password.
We were talking before about how important it is to have some sort of management process or guidelines for how you're managing the passwords and the password creation itself. You'd mentioned that there are different organizations that have different requirements. We talked about PCI. Do you mind kind of going into what are PCI's requirements versus others?
Yeah, so password complexity and length, and these are topics that are highly debated. Everybody has a different opinion. At a theoretical level, there's here's the standard best practices that everybody should use. The problem is, in the real world, those have been shown to be very weak. PCI does a really poor job. PCI requires that every password be 7 characters and that it include numbers and letters. That's it. That's the only requirement. That's a really, even 10 years ago, that was a really weak requirement. Microsoft does a little bit better. Microsoft their recommended guidelines for years now has been that the password should be 8 characters. It should require 3 out of 4 character types, uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and a symbol, all those other characters that don't fall into the other categories. There's other guidelines out there. The problem is, in a practical, real-world example, a lot of my job, I do what's called penetration testing, where I actually try to break into companies' networks, and I demonstrate for them, here's the flaws, here's what an attacker is going to do. We're simulating a bad guy, but we're going to do the same types of attacks. What we find is weak passwords are really, really easy to crack. And if I'm able to get onto a Windows system, for example, and dump the hashes, which is pretty easy to do, I can crack, even if it's completely random, I can crack an 8-character password in a couple of hours with a $3,000 system for password cracking that we built. This isn't like, some theoretical, here, let's build a $500,000 cracking system. This is cheap and easy to do. When you get to 9 characters on Windows, it's a little bit harder. 10 characters, now you're starting to get reasonable. But the problem is when we tell people, hey, you need a 10-character password, they say, well, PCI says I only have to have 7, so that's what I'm using. So what we like to do is try to encourage people to don't just think, hey, what is the minimum that I have to do for this, but what is a secure solution and what makes it better?
We were talking before, I think I'd heard something about, I think it's the National Institutes of Science and Technology, right?
Yeah.
NIST. What's going on there? They've come out recently with some new guidelines in terms of passwords?
Yeah, so NIST has had several guides over the years. They've got a new document that's out. I think it's 800-63 if somebody wants to look it up. I'm not sure if it's still in draft mode, but it's almost being formalized. It's been bounced around for almost a year now. It's got some really controversial ideas in it. At a first glance, when you read through it, it sounds like a paradise to these people that are complaining about hard passwords, because it says that shorter, longer doesn't necessarily make it better. It says that a short password of 8 characters or so is plenty. It says things like changing your password regularly isn't effective, and there's a lot of different things it goes into. The problem with that is that that document is really built on a sort of authentication paradigm that's not really in use today. It's designed so that as developers are developing new applications, if they use this paradigm and they use the controls and the solutions in that document, then the people that use those systems will be able to use weaker passwords. But that's not practical today with the systems that we have, because systems like operating systems like Windows and Linux and Mac, and even most of our web apps, they're not using the same paradigm that document is designed for. I know we're getting really technical, but I just want to make sure that people understand that just because someone says, hey, it doesn't have to be very complicated, you need to understand what you're talking about before you roll that in, because we're talking about real world risk to businesses. And merchants are compromised and resellers are compromised every day because of bad passwords.
And the assumption is that this paradigm, even if it is implemented at some point, it's going to be years before there's a new paradigm that's been fully implemented to where an 8-character password works just fine.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you're developing a web app today and you start using that document, that's awesome. But some of the things that it limits in there is your ability to reissue a password multiple times. If you log in several times and you fail, it locks your account quickly. Requirements for 2-factor authentication for everything. Several different levels of security control that are built into the system that today's systems just don't have.
Got it. A couple of questions. Well, again, as a reseller, so we've got the reseller audience that are watching this with us today. What kind of role should I play in coaching and training merchants, right? Because merchants, in a lot of cases, again, they've got a whole business that they're running. The tech, the point of sale solution is just an enabler for them to run their business. But we're talking about making sure that they keep that business secure, right?
Yeah.
So that they can protect that business over the long run, so they've got a legacy that they potentially can hand down to kids or others, right? Or that they could sell at some future date. If they get breached, they won't have a chance to do that. So what role should the reseller play in coaching and training their merchants on password management, password creation?
Absolutely, that's a great question. As a company at Secure Ideas, one of the things that we focus on is, we want to educate our customers. Like, that is our goal, is to educate. My boss says all the time, he hopes that we put ourselves out of business because we teach our customers how to do things securely themselves and not need us. Resellers have that same opportunity, and they need to take that type of a role in educating their merchants. Yes, we all need to sell stuff to make money. We need to be able to keep the lights on. But I'm a firm believer that if we become that trusted advisor, if we help educate people and inform them, they will come to us when they need help. And maybe not every time, but a lot of times they will buy our solution, right? So resellers need to help merchants understand, the merchant's job is to run a grocery store or to run a restaurant or, to run a doctor's office, whatever it may be. But they don't care about security a lot of times. The reseller's job is to help them understand, here's what you do need to care about, right? We can't go in and expect them to come sit in a 3-day seminar where they're going to learn everything there is to know. Some of them might, most won't. But we need to be able to break it down and say, here's some critical points that you need to worry about. Password management is important, and here's why. And we also need to simplify it enough that they can do it, right? If we provide a point of sale system that's perfectly secure, but it's so complex they can't use it, they're going to do one of two things. They're going to replace it, or they're going to modify it to make it easier to use, right? We see that all the time with, a cashier. They've got this secure solution, but they find a way to kind of hack at it and find a way to get their job done more efficiently, because that's what their goal is to get their job done.
Yeah. But along those lines, what kind of basic advice or guidance do you provide folks in terms of how often should I change my password?
That's a great question. And that's one of those ones that, is confrontational. Everybody has a different opinion on that. PCI says you have to change it every 90 days. So for compliance, every 90 days. That's been the traditional guidance. Microsoft has said that. NIST up until recently has said that. I like to tell people to step back and think about why you're doing that. And I guess maybe just to talk about the theory of that a little bit. The reason that you want to change a password every 90 days is that once that password is stolen, you don't want it to be used forever. If I'm a bad guy and I steal this password to your system and now I can log into your system anytime I want, that's really bad. So that's one side of it. The second reason that it's important to change passwords regularly is that, you have systems that are being backed up, right? That data is going somewhere and it's being stored. Now, if an attacker gains access to that data and they get data from 3 years ago and they can pull the passwords out of that and they can still log into the systems, that's a bad thing. So if you're changing those passwords on a somewhat regular basis, then the risk of those backups being lost is a little bit mitigated. It's not quite a big deal.
And is that similar to if I've got passwords that are, like admin passwords that are old that no one logs into the admin piece, does that solve it as well, or is that a different issue to consider?
That's a great point. The problem we get into is every system is unique. What the password is being used for, what the account's being used for, how it's being done, how it's being managed, how it's being stored. There's a lot of different factors that go into this. And so the reseller really needs to consider, okay, what am I required to do by PCI? What is practical for me to do? And then what's the secure solution? There are some passwords, like for instance, you may have a point of sale system that connects to a database, and that database has an administrator password, and nobody uses it. It's not written down anywhere, it's not stored anywhere, it was created once at install and it's never used again. The fact that you change that password every 90 days actually increases the risk, because now that password is being passed along, like people know it and it's being stored somewhere and that sort of thing. So in some cases, if it's not being used, letting it set is fine. Most of the time, the PCI QSAs who decide, this is good or this is bad, they're usually okay with that if it's a non-used password like that. I still think there's some value in changing them once in a while. Maybe not every 90 days. Maybe you go in once a year and you say, hey, we're going to go through and rechange everything and make sure everything's still good. And that's a great opportunity to verify some other things, make sure things are still configured, and do it from there. As far as merchants go, though, you need to be able to provide solutions for how they can easily change their passwords, how they can easily know how often to change them, and that sort of thing.
And there's a lot of instances, right, where the merchants may say to you or to some of the resellers and say, hey, how should I keep track of these? We talk about like password storage, right? Are there best practices or even tools or, things that you'd recommend that are a good way for them to follow a general best practice for keeping track of their passwords?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great tools out there nowadays. Just to list some of them, there's KeyPass as an open source tool, LastPass, OnePass, and there's several others. CyberArk is kind of the enterprise standard. It's the gold standard that's really expensive, but lots of great tools that allow merchants to manage their passwords, to allow anybody, all the way down to the individual, to manage their passwords. So for instance, on my system, I've got 2 different systems I use for different types of passwords. In both cases, most of my passwords, I don't know them. When I create a new account, I tell it to generate a password, and it's got my standard, I think it's like 32 characters, and it uses uppercase and lowercase and numbers and symbols, and it's all completely random. And so I tell it to generate a password, I put the password in the system, and I'm good to go. Next time I need to log into that system, I copy and paste, or some of the tools have that functionality built in, maybe into your browser plugin or something, so they can do it for you. But you don't even need to know those complex passwords. So there's a lot of great ways to do that out there. Resellers can use those tools, like for instance, if you have an administrative account at each merchant that needs to be stored somewhere, but you don't want to write it down, you can put those in various places, and your technicians can access them when needed, and it'll keep a log of who accessed what, when, and you can keep track that way, without having everybody has access to all these passwords.
So keeping all of my passwords in the front the page of my notebook is not the best practice, probably.
People laugh about that, and that's kind of one of those jokes that, well, you're writing it on a sticky note. It comes back to what I was saying before. You really got to take into consideration the situation. If this is a locked down system and nobody has access to this location, and you have a password on a sticky note, and you have ultimate physical security, there's not that much control. There's not that much to worry about there. Whereas if you have it written down on a notepad document, stored unencrypted on your computer, and lots of people have access to that, that's much worse. So you've got to consider, what is my solution, and how does it come into play in each of these different areas?
What I'm hearing from you is that password alone is not the be-all, end-all in terms of protecting everything that I've got with my business. There's a number of different variables that come into play, right? It's like all the ingredients in the baking of a cake or a pie or whatever. The password is just one of those ingredients, and it's important to understand the context or the paradigm in which that password is being used, stored, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's coming back to what we talked about earlier. Passwords are about authentication. And you have to think through, how is this person trying to authenticate, and what do I need to make sure that they are who they say they are? And that, if I can jump in, that comes back to what we talked about with 2-factor authentication. If you use 2-factor authentication, so now the person logging in has to know a password, and they have to have a token or a phone or some other form of authentication, I don't care so much about the complexity of that password, right? Because now you have to steal the password, and you have to steal that person's phone or gain access to it, or steal their physical token. That's a lot harder for an attacker to do.
Yeah.
And those tokens, because they change so often, I don't care if you steal the token, because 60 seconds later it's different. So if you're using 2-factor authentication, well, now you can use an 8-character password, or maybe even a 7-character password, and it's not that big a deal. And if you don't change it every 90 days, it's not that big a deal, because that token changes every 60 seconds. So there's some real strengths there.
Well, one last question for you on this topic. Are there other steps to prevent passwords from being stolen?
To prevent passwords from being stolen. So the first thing is, don't use them, right? If you don't use a password, it can't be stolen. That's not practical. It's not realistic, right? That's why we have them, is to use them. So you got to start thinking about, how do I use them? What am I doing? One thing that a lot of people mess up on is how they transfer passwords. I get all the time customers that send us passwords via email. Don't send me a password via email. Email's not secure. It's not encrypted. And what's really common is people will be like, well, I know I don't want to send you the username and password, so I'm going to send the username in one email and the password in another email. Well, if somebody's compromised either my email or yours or anywhere along the path, they're going to get both emails. So, think through how you're doing that. One of the ways, in person is always best. If you have to share a password. One way that I recommend is, send somebody a text with the username, and then have them call you and provide the password over the phone. So you have 2 out-of-band methods of sharing stuff, or maybe send the username over email and tell them to call you to get the password, stuff like that. So password communication transfer is one thing. Storage, we've talked a little bit about. Using a password manager and that sort of thing. That doesn't work in every solution, but if at all possible, you need to encrypt the password. You need to have it stored in an encrypted fashion. You need to control who has access to it. Saying, here we have this password solution, this password vault of some kind, but all of our employees have access to it, and they have access to every password that's in there. Well, that's no different than just having a bulletin board with all the passwords written on it. So you need to have some type of system that when people log in, it authenticates who has access, and they're limited, and then that you're logging who's able to get in and who doesn't. So those are just a couple of things that people can do. But the most critical is they need to think about the different types of passwords they have. They need to think about the scenarios that those are being used in, and then they need to put thought into the different areas of risk and how to protect those.
Great. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, and I'll actually add one other thing that people can do if they have questions about that. Give me a call, shoot me an email.
If any of the viewers want to learn more or go a little bit deeper on some of the topics that we covered today, what's the best place for folks to reach you?
So the easiest thing is to shoot me an email, securityadvisor@gorspa.org. You can also go to our website, gorspa.org, and there's a Ask an Advisor section where you can go on and fill out a form, and it'll submit a question that comes to me. I'll be at a lot of the RSPA conferences, so Inspire in the winter and Retail Now in the summer. And so if members visit there, they have a great opportunity to meet one-on-one and ask specific questions.
Great. Nathan, thank you very much for the time.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
All right.